Right, so if you want to, you can join me in the blessing for study. You can unmute and just step back from your microphone so that we can all hear each other say these words of blessing. Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam asher kiddushanu banu la'asot b'divrei Torah. That means we praise you, Eternal One, who is the creator or the source of life, who gives us commandments to make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage in words of Torah. It is traditionally forbidden on Tisha B'Av to engage in Torah study, except for on topics directly related to the destruction of the temple and to the meaning of Tisha B'Av. We as liberal Jews, of course, can choose what we do with that, but I'm really glad to be able to come together with you to study a topic that is meaningful to this day. And the reason, by the way, that it's traditionally forbidden to study Torah on Tisha B'Av, other than regarding this topic, is because studying Torah is a pleasurable activity. And Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning and of sadness. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So I'm putting into the chat the source sheet for today. I'm going to share it on my screen as well, but if you'd like to follow along, you can follow along that way as well. And our topic for today, as is in the title, is, are we really in mourning for the temple? And if not, what's the point of Tisha B'Av? So I intend this, as always, as a discussion / text study. So we're going to go through some texts, and I hope you'll participate. If you have thoughts or comments, then you can either raise your hand electronically, which you do in the controls at the bottom of your screen, or if you just wave at me like this, I can pretty much see everybody, so I'll call on you as well. I encourage you to turn on your camera if you're able to do so. This is meant to be like a classroom where we discuss together. If you're not able to turn on your camera, that's totally okay as well. So I want to start with a nigun, with a song, and it's the song that is traditionally sung from the Book of Lamentations, which is traditionally read on the day of Tisha B'Av. And I'm giving you both the words at the top as well as the music notes if you want to follow along. And the words to this mean, return us to you, Eternal One, and we will return. Renew our days as of old. So if you know it, you can please sing with me, either with the words or with la la la. And if you don't know it, sing anyway, because no one can hear you. You're on mute. Shivenu Adonai Elecha Venashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. These are almost the closing words of the Book of Lamentations. On Tisha B'Av, it's traditional to read from and to chant from the entire Book of Lamentations. Lamentations is a book, in Hebrew it's called Echa, which is what we have here at the top of the screen. Echa means how, and you'll see in just a moment why it begins with that way, how or alas. Echa or Lamentations is a book that is traditionally understood to have been written by the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the prophet who both foretold and lived through the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 586 BCE. And so tradition assigns to him the authorship of the Book of Lamentations. Whether he really wrote it or not, of course, we don't know. But the Book of Lamentations does seem to have been written by somebody who is in mourning for Jerusalem, someone who saw, who witnessed, and now is mourning or remembering the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and of the temple and of Jewish sovereignty by the Babylonians in the year 586. Now, to save you from my voice, I'm going to actually play a little bit of Eicha, so we can listen to what it sounds like, what the first couple of verses of Eicha sound like from YouTube. And this is Cantor Jeffrey Siegel of Beth Jacob Congregation in Columbus, Ohio. So we'll hear him, but we'll be able to see the words, what the words mean here on our screen. Hopefully this sound will work. Let me know if you're not hearing him in just a minute.
Yashva vadad, hayira bat yam, hayta kiamana, rabati vagoyim, sarati bamdinot, hayta lamas, bachotivke balayla, bedimata alecheya, ein la menachem mikol ohaveha koreha bagduva hayula leoivim galta yuda meoni umerov avoda hi ashva vagoyim lo matza manoach korotfeha yisiguha bein hamitzarim Darchei Tzion avelod, mibli ba'ev moed, kol she'areha shomemin, kohaneha nenachim, betuloteha nugot, vehimarla.
Okay, and I'm going to read in English as well what this means. And the question I want to talk about here is, what is the tone? What are we mourning for, at least according to the Book of Lamentations here? It starts, Eicha, alas, lonely sits the city once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. A princess among states is become a thrall. A thrall is like a slave or a servant. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh. Her maidens are unhappy. She is utterly disconsolate. Her enemies are now the masters. Her foes are at ease. Because the Eternal has afflicted her for her many transgressions, her infants have gone into captivity before the enemy. So those are the first 5 verses of the Book of Lamentations, which continues on for several more chapters. What jumps out at you here? What is the book? What is the author of Lamentations mourning for? What is the message that we convey to each other by singing or chanting or sharing these words with one another? And does it resonate with you? Any thoughts on what you see or hear before you? Anne, go ahead.
I think it resonates with hope, even though it's an enormous loss and a tragedy. This once beautiful temple, the people, the priceless treasures that were modeled and designed by Hashem. It's an enormous blow, aside from the sacrifice, which you can question, but it's hope because they are going to return. There is redemption and there's a path to return.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that, Anne. It's interesting that you see a message of hope here. I see some people shaking their heads. Maybe they don't see hope here necessarily. I saw mourning and I saw loss of comfort in the chat as well. And then also, ultimately that is our question: is Tisha B'Av a day of hope? Which I agree with you, Anne. I think it is ultimately a day of hope. I see Daniel, and then I see Carol. Go ahead, Daniel.
All right, thank you. You can hear me clearly, right?
Yes.
All right. What really stands out for me in these verses are like the first lines. Like, for example, lions' roads are in mourning, which is supposed to be, as I understood, the place closest to heaven. And when you really see the place closest to heaven in mourning, you really kind of see the contrast of its like purpose and what a reality really is, and this kind of contrast really like shows the tragedy of the Tisha B'Av events and what we went through as Jewish people, like through, and for example, also her enemies are now the masters, which could really like mean the Rome. The people of Rome controlling now the place of Judea, or if we like really go to the Holocaust thing, like the Nazis like really being our masters in the concentration camps, like it can really span through the entire history of the Jewish people, like how big of a tragedy or like the tragedies we're witnessing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Daniel. And as you point out, the ideas that originate here in this, and this is First Temple, right? This is long before Rome. It's long before World War II, of course, but the ideas that originate here make their way through history. And so to a certain extent, Tisha B'Av becomes a day that's about more than just the destruction of the temple in ancient times. And somebody put in the chat, Betsy put in the chat, the idea of profound loss. And I think also I would add to that the word emptiness, both literal emptiness, the idea of the streets being empty, right? The roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims here in verse 4, but also the profound emptiness of loss, the emptiness of remembering something that was, that is no more, I think is very present here. Carol, go ahead.
What bothers me most is section 5. It always does, because the Lord has afflicted her for her many transgressions. And I see it over and over again that anything bad that happens ends up being because the Jews of the time did something wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this has often been the theological response of Jews to tragedy. What did we do to bring this upon ourselves? It's deeply uncomfortable, I think, especially for modern people, and maybe especially after the Holocaust, right? After the Holocaust, it's impossible to say, what did we do wrong to bring this upon ourselves? Because how can you possibly imagine that the suffering on the scale of the Shoah could be in any way an act of God, right? And Rabbi Richard Rubenstein puts it best, where he says, essentially, there is no meaning in Auschwitz. And by which he means there is no meaning to be made in terms of asking why it happened, only asking how can we prevent it again? How can we make meaning in a world? But what's interesting to note is that very possibly the idea that our transgressions bring upon us these punishments is responsible for Judaism as we know it, because the original Jews, when their city was destroyed, they carried with them the idea that God had brought this upon them to teach them something, and that God was still with them. So that when they came back, or when they went out into exile, rather than believing that the past was dead, they believed that the past was intended to teach them a lesson. And that lesson, the idea that God is in covenant with us, ultimately became Judaism. So this idea of reward and punishment is in some ways a double-edged sword, because it's both deeply uncomfortable, but it also says somebody cares about you, the somebody here being God. Now, of course, we as liberal Jews, we have all kinds of different ways of thinking about God. But historically, the idea that somebody's there who cares enough to visit this kind of thing upon you and who continues to be in relationship with you is really very central to Judaism. In fact, Judaism as we know it, I think, has been built around the idea of remembering and mourning the temple in Jerusalem, not just on Tisha B'Av, but every single day. So I want to read you this Mishnah, and then I want to jump to the prayer book. The Mishnah is the Jewish law code of the year 200. This is the first Jewish law code written by the in many ways by the very rabbis who witnessed the destruction of the temple and the generation or two that followed. And they write that here are the things that happened on the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is, of course, Tisha B'Av. That's what Tisha B'Av means. They say on the 9th of Av, there are 5 things that happened. Number 1, it was decreed that our ancestors would not enter the land. That's the story of the scouts in the Torah, for those who know that story, where God decrees that we have to wander for 40 years. How they decide that was on Tisha B'Av is a matter of midrashic magic, right? It doesn't say that anywhere in the Torah, but the rabbis decide it is. Number 2, the temple was destroyed the first and second time. That's our second and third tragedies of Tisha B'Av, both by the Babylonians in 586 and by the Romans in the year 70 CE. Now, it's either an extraordinarily meaningful coincidence, which it very well may be, or it's a little bit contrived, historically speaking. The Tanakh does say that the Babylonians were in the city between the 7th and 10th of Av. Doesn't exactly say that the first temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av, but it's right around that same time. Finally, Beitar was captured and the city of Jerusalem was plowed. Those are having to do with the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 120-ish, so post-temple. So you have here 5 different tragedies that occurred on Tisha B'Av in 5 different time periods, in fact, or at least 4 different time periods. And to that, we can add other tragedies, including the expulsion from the Jews in England, the expulsion from Spain in 1492, Germany's declaration of war on Russia that began World War II, that began the Holocaust, happened on Tisha B'Av, and the first transports that reached Treblinka. So there are a number of things that have happened throughout the years on Tisha B'Av. And yet what stands at the center of Tisha B'Av, and what has really in many ways stood at the center of the Jewish psyche, is the destruction of the temple and the going into exile of the Jews. It represents a lot of what Jews have been praying for and thinking about and talking about for the last 2,000 years. And the best expression of that is here in our daily prayer book. This is the traditional, or today we call Orthodox Amidah, the daily service as found in an Orthodox prayer book. What are the things that we pray for? We say, sound the great shofar for our freedom, and raise the banner to gather our exiles, and gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth. Praise to you, Adonai, who gathers the dispersed of your people of Israel. We also pray, restore our judges, as in the beginning. Judges here meaning political leaders and judges over the people in the land of Israel. And our counselors, as in beginning times. Remove from us sorrow and groaning, and reign over us, O Adonai, alone, in loving kindness and mercy. Justify us in judgment, which justify us in judgment literally means vindicate us, God. In other words, vindicate our exile, bring our exile to an end. Blessed are you, lover of righteousness and justice. We also pray traditionally every day, to Jerusalem, your city, may you return with mercy and dwell in the midst of it as you have spoken, and build it soon, rebuild Jerusalem soon and in our day as an eternal structure. Quickly establish the throne of David. Blessed are you, Adonai, the builder of Jerusalem. And furthermore, on a regular basis, we say, cause the offshoot of your servant David to sprout, which is to say, bring a Messiah, God. Send a Messiah to bring us back to sovereignty in Jerusalem. And finally, restore the service of your holy temple. So on a daily basis for the last 2,000 years, Jews have been praying for what? For the restoration of the temple, for the restoration of the line of David as the proper rulers over the Jewish people, for the rebuilding of Jerusalem as a city, for the restoration of judges and leaders over the Jews in our, sovereignty in our land, and finally for the ingathering of the exiles, the end of an exile that began with the destruction of the temple. And so the temple itself becomes a great symbol for everything, the destruction of the temple, that is to say, becomes a great symbol in many ways for everything that has gone wrong in Jewish life, for the fact that we're in exile, for the fact that we can't return to our land and have sovereignty in our land, for the fact that the world is broken, for the idea that the world could be better, and right now it is quite broken. Jews are praying for these things on a daily basis for the last 2,000 years. So now I want to, and one more text. This is our commentary on the Mishnah. I'll just note, and the Mishnah that we looked at before, after it lists all those 5 things that went wrong, it says, from when the month of Av begins, one decreases one's rejoicing. Mishenichnas Av, mam'itin b'simcha. Now, some of you might know a song for Purim that sounds a little bit like that, which says, Mishenichnas Adar marbin b'simcha. When Adar enters, we increase in joy. Anybody know that song? Is that familiar to some of you? I see a couple of nods. Yes, it's like a big, happy, upbeat song. When Adar enters, we increase in joy. And when Av enters, so that's 9 days ago, we're supposed to decrease in joy. We're supposed to be sad all month long. We're supposed to be mourning the destruction of the temple all month long. It's this time of incredible mutedness, of incredible mourning, of looking backwards, of lamenting, of wishing and hoping, and longing for what was and is no longer. And so I guess what I want to ask you is how this resonates with you. Let's pause now. I want to ask your reactions, your thoughts to all of this. Do you feel yourself to be in mourning for the temple? And do you feel that the texts we've just read speak to you and the Jewish life that you are living? And why or why not, and how or how or not, and how not? I totally stumped the crowd here. I see someone says does not really speak to me.
I'm typing something, but I just don't feel like talking today. So
no problem. Yeah, feel free to type then. Anne, I see your hand up though. Go ahead.
This is part of us. It's our history. It's our heritage. It's our spirituality. And for me personally, I do feel it quite strongly. And I love the poetry of Lamentations. If you read it, it's just beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I see Robert's comment does not really speak to me. I don't know why. And let's read Stacy's comment as well. I don't necessarily think about the destruction of a temple, either first or second, on a very frequent basis. But thinking about the destruction, visualizing it, gruesomely tragic, and is gruesomely tragic, and it afflicts me in a unique dimension. So it's interesting to think, often talk about Tisha B'Av is focused on the temple, right? Because of course Tisha B'Av is the day of the destruction of the temple. But what I think I understand from several of you is that it goes beyond that. There's a larger tragedy here that we're thinking about. And in just a minute, we're going to take a deeper look at the question of the temple and whether that even matters to us as Jews, and whether that affects how we think about this day. But I see Daniel's comment, Daniel's hand up. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. This was today, this was one of the most intensive Tisha B'Av that I had, also thinking about the temple, where I was deeply investigating about it. And I was thinking to myself, I spoke to a Christian friend of mine about the Jewish temple a few days before, and put it in a metaphor that what's left of the temple in the nowadays that we are all in the diaspora. And I think to myself is for example, that our bodies are like the Jewish temple, and with the light of what we celebrate in Hanukkah is what is left, what is our unique third temple, and what cannot be taken, even though one of us is being killed. There's another Jew with a new Jewish temple, and with a new soul, with the light in the temple, like is being born and is carrying around and could like make the world a better place. So with that being said, of course, it's a big tragedy. This was the heart of Judaism for many of thousand years that we have lost, and it's of course a tragedy. But one of the tragedies that happened in Tisha B'Av, as you said, with the most recent events, with the deportation to the concentration camps, or with the Warsaw Ghetto, with the extermination of from England and Spain and so on. And as you said, like it's more of the sum of the tragedies that happened in this day. It's like comparable to the 9th of November, what we have here in Germany, where we are also like in a specific mourn of the Reichspogromnacht, it is called, where the Nazis destroyed the synagogues and so on, and where a lot of like bad things like this happened, like the failed assassination of Adolf Hitler, or where he started like the putsch and so on. And it's like comparable to that. It's not like one single event, but it's of course the destruction of the temple what stood out the most in our in our Jewish history. And this would be like my part of side, and where I'm referring to as my tragedies that happened in my life, is where this is the only like base where I can relate to that. Have not been, I just have been to the hotel and not to the temple itself. So it's not like I have like a deep like personal bond, just only like the spiritual one, which is referred to our history and so on.
Right.
And this would be like my side of the day.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the temple becomes a sort of a symbol for something larger, for all the various brokennesses, right, that exist in Jewish life, which is why I think Tisha B'Av in modern times, especially in liberal circles, has become much more about sort of the broader, tragedies of Jewish life. In fact, I wasn't going to look at this yet, but this is interesting to note that there is a Tisha B'Av service in the Gates of Prayer, the Reformed prayer book that was put out in 1976, might be 77. But look what it's called. It's a service for Tisha B'Av and Yom HaShoah, right? In other words, this is a service for all the tragic days on our calendar. I mean, the truth is, I put this out to my rabbinic colleagues earlier this week. Why isn't there a Tisha B'Av service in our current Reformed prayer book? And several people wrote back to me and said, well, we don't observe it. It's not meaningful to us. We're not marking it in our congregations. And I think that is, there are a lot of people in modern times who simply don't mark Tisha B'Av because they're thinking about the temple, and they're not feeling themselves in mourning for the temple. And there are others who are thinking of Tisha B'Av, maybe in the way you are, as being more widely about the tragedies, the moments in our history, the sort of series of moments in our history that need to be mourned. I see Lauren's hand up. Go ahead, Lauren.
I sort of relate to what you said to begin with. I think that modern Reform Judaism, at least as I was exposed to it, from the early 50s, doesn't really recognize this holiday. But as of today, when I'm really studying more about it, I think it offers a touchstone to who we are. I don't think we can do in our lives things without having either a lesson or some reference. And I think this holiday offers that type of reference. And I think that's important. So I read it as a modern Reformed Jew, as a commentary on what happened, but also in reference to what the history of Judaism has been, and the messages that we get from our liturgy. There's also hope. At least there's a charge to do better and to be aware of what we're doing. And that message needs to start with a sort of a clarion call of what the potential could be if we don't do that. So that's what
I appreciate that. And, that's something Anne said that toward the very beginning, right? That she looked at the book of Lamentations and she saw hope. I think we have taught ourselves over centuries that tragedy means hope, that, when you look at tragedy, it is a reminder that there must be hope, that we must feel ourselves responsible to make the world better because these things happen. I think that's a deeply Jewish idea. It's not only a Jewish idea, but it is a Jewish idea. And just to respond to what Rick just said in the chat, I'm not saying all Reform rabbis say that Tisha B'Av doesn't matter. I'm saying several of my colleagues said, oh, we're simply not marking it in our synagogue, which, by the way, I think is really common in liberal synagogues these days, not to mark Tisha B'Av because, for whatever reason, it's not. Most people aren't fasting. Most people aren't observing it. We're not thinking of ourselves as being in mourning. We don't think of ourselves as being in exile, right? For a whole variety of reasons. Carol, go ahead.
I know my hand has been up and down several times, but Lauren said basically where I was going. It's a point that one can, it's a reference point for what happened from there on. And all of the other tragedies that have occurred since then. And for some reason or other, that's the only part of it that speaks to me, that basically, yes, there were tragedies before, but this was the tragedy and it has progressed and someday maybe we'll get it fixed.
Yeah, thank you. So let's focus on the temple for a minute, because the temple really is the primary focus of Tisha B'Av, at least in a traditional way. Like we can say, we can talk about the Holocaust and we can talk about Beitar and all the sufferings through history, and yet the temple is what most of Tisha B'Av observance has been based around. And our conflict with the temple is actually not only our conflict, it's actually quite old. Let me show you what Maimonides says 1,000 years ago. Maimonides is I assume is a name that's familiar to most of you, 12th century Sephardic Jewish philosopher, physician, rabbi. He writes halakha, he writes philosophy. I've heard it said before that Maimonides is exactly who you want to bring home to your Jewish mother because he's both a doctor and a lawyer. Right? Maimonides sort of does it all. And Maimonides, in many ways, there are two Maimonides. They say you can have your Maimonides and I'll have my Maimonides, because Maimonides has two distinctly different bodies of writing, one of which is halakhic, legal, and the other of which is philosophical. And on this point, it almost seems like two different people wrote these. In the Mishnah Torah, which is Maimonides' book of Jewish law, he writes as follows, and all we really need is to read the first sentence. It is a positive commandment to construct, and you also could read this as rebuild the house for God, prepared for sacrifices to be offered within. In other words, it is a mitzvah, it is a commandment to rebuild the temple. Doesn't mean we got to go do it right now. There's an argument over whether we'll do it or whether God will do it or whether the Messiah will do it, but it is something that must be done. And Maimonides then goes on for the next chapter to describe the rebuilding of the temple, what it's going to look like, how it's going to be done, the materials, in quite a bit of detail. That's the first thing he says. Temple must be rebuilt. Then in the Guide of the Perplexed, he says the following. I'm going to read this mostly in its entirety because it's so fascinating. He says, consider, I'm right up here, how a baby animal gradually grows stronger and can be weaned from its mother's milk. Many precepts in our law are the result of a similar course adopted by the Supreme Being. It is namely impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to another. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him suddenly to discontinue everything to which he had become accustomed. Now, God sent Moses to make the Israelites a kingdom of priests and a holy nation by means of the knowledge of God. But the custom which was in those days general among all human beings, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought down, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow to those images, and by images, but here he means idols, and to burn incense before them. It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, as displayed in the whole creation, that God did not command us to give up and discontinue all these manners of service, for to obey such a commandment would have been contrary to the nature of man, who, he essentially says here, people like what they're used to, right? It is in those days. So in other words, let me stop and explain what Maimonides is saying here. In ancient times, how did people worship? Pre-Jewish, pre-Israel, how did people worship? They did it through sacrifice, right? They sacrificed to their gods. They sacrificed to their idols. So suppose a prophet showed up one day and said, no more sacrificing. There's only one God, and all you can do is talk to God. Maimonides says people would have chased him out of the room. They would never have gone in for such a huge change because, as he says, people are creatures of habit. People like what they know. Therefore, God instituted a temple because the temple would teach us to do what we had been doing, which is sacrifice to, sacrifice animals, but to do it to God rather than to idols. Okay, everybody with me so far on what Maimonides says here? So therefore, he says, he doesn't quite go as far as saying, then God allowed the temple to be destroyed because we no longer needed to sacrifice. We could learn how to simply pray to God. But he does say there's a lot of restrictions around sacrifice. It can only be done in a temple in Jerusalem, only by priests, only in one location, only on the altar. I'm at the bottom of the page now. All these restrictions serve to limit this kind of worship and keep it within the bounds within which God did not think it necessary to abolish sacrificial service altogether, which is to say, God wanted to limit sacrifice. People needed it. God wanted to limit it as much as possible. But prayer and supplication can be offered everywhere and by every person. And the same is true of tzitzit, mezuzah, tefillin, and other kinds of divine service. So while temple sacrifice was deeply limited, things like prayer and tzitzit and mezuzah and tefillin and all that, those can be done by anybody and anywhere. And God designed it that way so that those would be more accessible and carried around the world. Now, let me ask you a question. Does Maimonides believe that the temple should be rebuilt? Does Maimonides want to rebuild the temple based on what we just read? I see people shaking heads. Maybe.
We were talking about this in the chat a little bit.
Oh yeah? Tell me what you were talking about.
Okay, I'll sort of read it. So Anne said, how would rebuilding of the temple change our Jewish lives? I said, if it were attempted without a universally recognized and obvious divine revelation inspiring it, it would be nothing short of World War III. And Daniel said that with the fact that the Muslims respectively have their own holy monasteries, the dome and the mosque on top of the mountain, we need to deal with that without becoming like the destroyer of our own temples. But this needs to be a topic when Israel is finally in peace with the Palestinians, surely a long way until then. I said, if we are to imagine that indeed the third temple can only be built by Moshiach, then it is not for us to even consider doing so. When that time comes, Baruch Hashem, nobody will be able to deny, and peace will come over the whole world.
Okay.
And then I also, Daniel said, the temple is not only going to be built for us, but for the entire world, no matter their belief. And I said, the fact that there is no imagining this in the current geopolitical context is a profound fact that appears to me to have been put in place by God to prevent us from arrogance.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for all that. It's interesting, the discussion. And what Maimonides would add to all that here is that it's not clear Maimonides believes at all that the temple needs to be rebuilt. He seems to think that the destruction of the temple is what allowed us to evolve into a new form of religion, right? Because now we know how to pray. Prayer is where we were headed anyway. And so why would we go back and rebuild something that would take us backwards toward an older, more primitive form of worship? And yet in the Mishnah Torah, he also says it is a positive commandment to construct a house of God. So Maimonides seems to be conflicted about that. And it's interesting that when the earliest reformers started to think about what Tisha B'Av would mean in modern Reform Judaism, they seized on what Maimonides had said here. And they said essentially that the temple, to rebuild the temple would be to go backwards. We're not looking for a return to animal sacrifice. So why would we be looking to rebuild the temple? We're not looking for a return to the particularism of that. So why would we be looking to rebuild the temple? They wrote, and this is from 1887, we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope. In other words, what is Israel's great messianic hope? The modern era of universal culture for the early reformers, not the rebuilding of the temple, not the coming of a Messiah and a return to sovereignty in Israel, not separating ourselves out from the nations and going back to Palestine, but rather, and they even say it, right? We expect neither a return to Palestine, nor sacrificial worship, nor a restoration of any laws concerning the Jewish state. We're not looking to go back to what we used to be. We believe that Judaism is something that is of universal import. We believe that Judaism is something that needs to be building hope for all. And that's not what a return to animal sacrifice means. And so in his 1896 prayer book, Rabbi David Einhorn, who's again one of these early radical reform rabbis, goes as far as to make Tisha B'Av a day of feasting, a day of celebration. He says, the one temple in Jerusalem sank into the dust in order that countless temples might arise to your glory and honor all over the wide surface of the globe. In other words, the destruction of the temple was a watershed moment in Judaism becoming what it was supposed to be. We are supposed to have temples all over the world, not just the one in Jerusalem. So today, let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Everybody have your l'chaim ready, right? To celebrate the destruction of the temple and the fact that Judaism has moved out of the era in which we needed a temple. How does this resonate with you? Who's ready to celebrate Tisha B'Av because the temple was destroyed, which moved us forward? Robert, you said yes. Robert, you want to tell us more?
I just think it gives meaning. It's what we do in Lasok. We take ancient texts and get modern meaning. And I think it just makes more sense to be hopeful and joyous in a world where every day seems like Tisha B'Av, every day seems like the destruction of the temple. As I put in the chat, every day we see the rise of fascism, eco-terrorism, poverty, the gap widening. So why not celebrate and feast and look towards hope and do tikkun olam and try to make the world better? My question is, I think we would be completely pooped upon by the Orthodox Jews who already have reason to say we're not Jewish, that this would be called absolute heresy. Not to me, but I can just see being on J Twitter and saying something like that and being murdered by like 25 people.
Okay, so fair enough. So I have to tell you, I agree with what Maimonides said from an intellectual standpoint almost entirely. I'm not looking to rebuild the temple. I'm not looking to go back to animal sacrifice, right? So as you point out, Robert, that would be, to celebrate today would be a huge break from what Tisha B'Av has traditionally meant, right? And so that's one reason that maybe we wouldn't feast on Tisha B'Av. Let's hear some other thoughts about this. I see Daniel, then I see Anne.
All right. Before I point out the message that I wrote in the chat, I wanted also to remind that as we concluded that Tisha B'Av is not only the purpose of that we mourn about the destroyed temple. It's of course like many more things that that we are mourning to, and so it would be like to shortly thought that we should celebrate it only because we don't have a temple anymore. Let's celebrate that we have many more synagogues and that we have as a substitute. So we should still keep the mourning part of Tisha B'Av, and maybe if we break the fast, I mean, here in Germany, 3 or 4 hours left for that. Can't wait for that. Maybe that would be a point where we say, hey, but look how we dealt with the tragedy. And this exactly points out what I wrote in the chat and left everyone that maybe does not want to speak out here in voice, but maybe wants to react to it in the chat. I wrote, I mean, aren't the plenties of synagogues, some of them as beautiful as it could be, the kind of substitute for a solo temple, the sign of our evolution as a nation and religion? And I just see positive reactions to that, and maybe it could be the answer like to to your point or to your question, is that we evolve from this two destructions of a temple to a sort of that in nearly every part of the world we have synagogues where we can go to, where we can visit the communities, to where like so connecting in like a world of diversities and many peoples in diasporas, and we're maybe one of the biggest example that we move forward to that and make the best of the biggest tragedies that we're faced upon to.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate that sentiment. I think, here's the thing, that in Judaism and in human life, two things can be true at the same time, which is to say that we cannot desire a return to the temple, and we can see that there is something to celebrate there. And maybe in particular, the idea that we have weathered and grown from all of this, right? Without the destruction of a temple, there would not be Judaism as we know it. That is a very likely fact. And that, in a sense, there's something worth celebrating there. And yet I have to tell you, I'm not feeling ready to make Tisha B'Av a feast day, because there's still so much sadness and mourning tied up with it. And so I think those two things can be true at the same time. And I like your idea, Daniel, of, like l'chaim at the end of the day, right? For those who are fasting, that you end Tisha B'Av on a note of forward-lookingness and hope, recognizing just how much there is to celebrate about the fact that we have not only survived, but actually thrived through these events like the destruction of a temple. And I've often noticed just how much we Jews respond to tragedy with creativity. And in many ways, the Torah as a written document is a result of the destruction of the first temple. The Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism is a result of the destruction of the second temple. Kabbalah is born out of the expulsion from Spain. We have often responded to tragedy with creativity and by growing, by moving Judaism to a new phase. Does that mean that we're not mourning? I don't think it does. I don't think it means that we entirely replace it with celebration. And yet I think we have to recognize the forward-lookingness and the hope that's born, that is born out of these tragedies at the same time. Speaking of hope, that was what Anne said at the very beginning. Go ahead, Anne.
I don't think anybody wants to sacrifice animals again, maybe the Karaites. But that being said, we're meant to take a moment and honor not only those items that are holy, but those times that are holy. It's respect. We take this moment of sadness and honor those holy times and those places. And I think it's just important that we do that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And also to learn the lessons of history. And there are two more texts I want to show you, but one of them is too long really to look at. So I'll just tell you what it's about. And this is, I'm going to email out this text document to everybody afterwards anyway, so you can read it for yourselves. But this story, which is from the Talmud, from Tractate Gittin, tells the rabbi's story about how the temple came to be destroyed. It's a very famous passage that some of you might be familiar with, which is called the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Is that familiar to anybody here? So the basic story is that the destruction of Jerusalem came about because of a guy named Kamsa and a guy named Bar Kamsa. Kamsa is not actually in the story, only Bar Kamsa. And the story goes in brief that this person means to invite Kamsa to his party in Jerusalem, but he accidentally invites Bar Kamsa, his enemy, instead. And when Bar Kamsa gets there, he very cruelly throws him out of the party in front of everybody. Bar Kamsa watches himself being thrown out of this party in front of all the rabbis and says, they must all be against me. I'm going to go inform on them to the Roman government. The Roman government believes now that the Jews are rebelling and comes and puts down the rebellion cruelly. In the midst of this cruelty, there is a siege going on in the city, and the Jews that are divided into factions, and the Zealots, which is the party that's rebelling, burns the stores of wheat in the Jewish city, in the city of Jerusalem, so that the city cannot withstand its own siege. so that when the temple is finally destroyed, the rabbis understand that this was due to the zealots burning their own wheat, the way that the Jews turned against each other, and the fact that nobody stood up for Bar Kamsa when he was being publicly embarrassed at a party. That's the rabbi's story about how the temple came to be destroyed because of, as Angel said in the chat, because of baseless hatred, because of sinat chinam. The rabbis could have blamed this on the Romans. They could have blamed it on God. They could have blamed it on 1,000 different things, but instead they said, we brought about the destruction of the temple because we couldn't get along with each other, because we couldn't find ways to be kind to each other. Because of our own baseless hatred, we brought about the temple. And as I look at Israel today, and as I look at the state of the Jewish people today, I can't help but wonder if we are repeating the same sins of the Second Temple period, if we have forgotten to see the humanity in those who believe differently than we do, who practice differently than we do, and if we are bringing down the Jewish people in much the same way that the rabbis say we brought ourselves down the last time around. So I think we do need to take time to mourn. We do need to take time to remember. We do need to take time to learn the lessons of history. If Tisha B'Av were simply a feast day, then a day of celebration, then there wouldn't be room to remember the tragedy and to learn the lessons that brought about this day. I have one more text to show you, but I see Stacy's hand, and if there's any other short comments, please let's go ahead and make them now, and then we'll end with this one last text. Go ahead, Stacy.
Just regarding the present situation in Israel, and the idea that it comes from like internal strife. I feel like it's just in general with the situation that's transpired in Israel since the beginning of Zionism, like the idea of a nation state and the idea of essentially like doing colonialism was just normalized and okay in that time, but that is not intrinsic to our Judaism. It's like it feels like as though in being pushed out into the nations, we've become subsumed into sort of worldly politics, and we're carrying with us the burden of justifying things that from a grander perspective we would understand that we should not do.
Yeah, fair enough. I think there's a much wider discussion to be had about Israel and Zionism, which I would love to have with you. And I mean, I think it's worth noting that much of what we've been longing for the last 2,000 years was a return to sovereignty, and that sovereignty is complicated, right? And that what you actually build when you return to sovereignty is possibly different than what you dreamed about. One last quick text. I know we're just about out of time here. This is a text that I actually studied this morning with my study partner. I did not intend to end with this today, but I loved it so much that I translated it and brought it here for you. This is from the Netivot Shalom, who is the previous Slonemer Rebbe, the Rebbe of Slonim, died about 20 years ago. He writes, the meaning of our mourning over the Beit Mikdash is non-coming to terms, or in Hebrew, hashlama, with the destruction of the temple and a longing for rebuilding. Israel is never even for a moment to come to terms with the fact that the temple has been destroyed. In other words, it's not only that we're mourning for the destruction of the temple. He says we're supposed to have hashlama. We're not supposed to reconcile ourselves with this idea. Hashlama comes from the word shalom, which means peace, right? We're never supposed to make peace with the fact that things are broken the way they are broken. Not only should you remember it, you should never become okay with it. He says they should always keep its memory in their hearts and long for it and look forward to a time when it will be rebuilt. And by this, we can understand what the Rebbe of Kubrin teaches, that the worst thing is to become reconciled with the situation as it is. In other words, it's one thing to live in a broken world. It's another thing to be okay with living in a broken world, to say to yourself, the world is what it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. Judaism teaches us never to have hashlama, never to become reconciled with the idea that the world is broken and there's nothing we can do about it, but rather to always believe that we have both the capacity and the responsibility to do something about it. Whether the something is rebuilding a temple from ancient times or remembering what things used to be like, or whether the something is what I think the temple is meant to symbolize, which is the brokenness of the world and the ways that we have a responsibility to repair it. So ultimately, our responsibility on Tisha B'Av and every day is to never become reconciled with brokenness and to always believe that we have the capacity and that we are responsible to do something to repair the brokenness. So with that, I'll wish everyone a meaningful Tisha B'Av, a meaningful fast if you are fasting. And thanks for joining me for a little bit of learning today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Micah.
Thank you, Micah. Bye.
Thanks so much.